November 5, 1941. Bureau of Ships, Main Navy Building, Washington. John Niedermair sat at his desk, reading a British dispatch that had arrived just hours earlier. The technical director of preliminary ship design had spent 15 years solving naval architecture problems, but this request was different. The British Admiralty wanted a ship that could carry 30 heavy tanks across the Atlantic Ocean, then drive directly onto an enemy beach without any port facilities whatsoever. The Navy's own engineers had been working on this problem for months and produced nothing workable. The converted Lake Maracaibo tankers the British were testing proved too slow and unwieldy. Every design attempted so far failed to reconcile a fundamental contradiction. Ocean crossings required deep draft for stability, but beach landings demanded shallow draft to approach shore. Niedermair pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began sketching. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Within hours, he had drawn an awkward-looking vessel with a flat bottom, massive bow doors, and a revolutionary ballast system. This ungainly ship would carry 2,100 tons of cargo directly onto hostile beaches. It would make amphibious warfare possible on a scale never before imagined. And it would accomplish something the Japanese High Command had calculated was impossible: landing overwhelming force on beaches that had no ports, no infrastructure, nothing but sand and the enemy waiting behind it. The sketch Niedermair sent to Britain that same day would become the LST, Landing Ship Tank, and its existence would fundamentally alter Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific. Because when Japanese intelligence officers finally understood what these ships could do, they realized every calculation they had made about defending their empire was wrong. The problem began in June 1940, at Dunkirk. Over 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated from the beaches under German fire, but they left behind all their heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, everything that makes an army capable of offensive operations was abandoned on French soil. Winston Churchill, watching the evacuation from London, understood immediately what this meant. The British Army could rebuild its manpower, but returning to continental Europe would require landing that heavy equipment on defended beaches. Traditional naval doctrine said this was impossible. You needed ports to unload heavy cargo. Ports had cranes, docks, piers, the infrastructure to transfer tanks from ships to shore. But the Germans controlled every port on the European coast. They were fortifying them, turning places like Cherbourg and Calais into fortresses that would cost thousands of lives to capture. Churchill had been thinking about this problem since 1917, when he proposed using specially designed vessels to land tanks on beaches during the First World War. That war ended before his idea could be tested, but now, 23 years later, the concept was desperately needed. The British began converting 3 shallow draft tankers, built originally to cross the sandbars of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. Bachaquero, Misoa, and Tasajera were cut open, fitted with bow ramps, and redesignated as landing ships tank. They could carry 22 heavy tanks or 33 lighter vehicles. The conversions were completed by August 1941, and trials began immediately. The results were disappointing. The converted tankers were slow, only 10 knots maximum speed. Their bluff bows pushed water inefficiently. Most critically, they could only beach on steeply sloped beaches. If the beach gradient wasn't steep enough, the ships grounded too far from shore, and the ramps couldn't reach dry land. British naval architects began working on purpose-built designs. The Boxer class, 3 ships ordered in March 1941, were an improvement. They could make 18 knots and carry 13 Churchill infantry tanks plus 27 other vehicles, and nearly 200 troops. But they still required relatively deep water to function, necessitating extremely long ramps that stored behind the bow doors. By August 1941, when Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Atlantic Conference in Newfoundland, the Admiralty understood they needed American industrial capacity to build these ships in the numbers required. Churchill was planning invasions across the Mediterranean and eventually back into France. Each operation would require hundreds of landing ships. Britain's shipyards couldn't produce them in time while also building destroyers, corvettes, and all the other vessels the Royal Navy desperately needed. The American delegation listened to the British requirements: an ocean-going ship capable of crossing the Atlantic, able to carry at least 20 heavy tanks, shallow enough draft to beach on any gradually sloped shore, capable of discharging cargo directly onto the beach without any port facilities, simple enough to build quickly in mass production. In November 1941, a small British delegation arrived at the Navy Department in Washington to coordinate detailed planning. The Americans agreed to design and build the ships. John Niedermair, as Technical Director of Preliminary Ship Design, received the assignment. Niedermair had been with the Bureau of Ships since 1928. He'd worked on submarine salvage operations in the 1920s, designed stability systems for merchant ships, and contributed to preliminary designs for cruisers and aircraft carriers. He understood ships at a fundamental level, how they behaved in different sea states, how weight distribution affected performance, how structural strength had to be balanced against cargo capacity. The problem before him was genuinely difficult. A ship needs deep draft for ocean stability. The deeper the hull sits in the water, the more stable the vessel in heavy seas. But beach landings require shallow draft. The ship has to approach as close to shore as possible, which means drawing minimal water. These requirements directly contradicted each other. Niedermair conceived of a solution that seemed obvious once stated but required genuine insight to develop. The ship would carry its own ballast system. For ocean transit, enormous ballast tanks would be flooded with seawater, giving the vessel deep draft and stability. Approaching a beach for landing operations, pumps would empty the ballast tanks, raising the ship in the water and creating the shallow draft needed to reach shore. The ballast system was massive. When fully flooded for ocean transit, the LST would draw 14 feet of water. When pumped out for landing, the draft forward would be only 3 feet 9 inches. That shallow forward draft would allow the ship to drive directly onto any beach with a gradual slope. Niedermair sketched out the basic design on November 4th. The ship would be 328 feet long, 50 feet wide. The bow would be a massive clamshell door that opened to reveal a ramp. When the ship beached, the doors would swing open, the ramp would lower, and vehicles could drive directly from the tank deck onto the beach. The tank deck itself would be an enormous open space, 230 feet long, 30 feet wide, 12 feet high. No internal bulkheads would obstruct vehicle movement. 20 Sherman tanks could fit inside with room to maneuver. The deck could alternatively carry trucks, artillery, ammunition, supplies, whatever the mission required. Above the tank deck, the main deck could carry additional vehicles lashed down in the open air. An elevator, later replaced by a ramp, would move vehicles between decks. The ship could even carry a landing craft tank on its main deck, piggyback style, dramatically extending operational reach. Niedermair sent his rough sketch to Britain on November 5th. The Admiralty approved it immediately. They requested the United States build 200 LSTs under Lend-Lease. The preliminary design called for a ship 280 feet long, but by January 1942, the Bureau of Ships had stretched the design twice, first to 290 feet, then to the final 328 feet. The longer hull distributed the ship's weight over a greater area, allowing it to ride higher in the water during landing operations. It also increased cargo capacity. The final design could carry 2,100 tons of cargo, far exceeding original requirements. By February 1942, Niedermair's team had completed detailed design work. They immediately turned specifications over to Gibbs & Cox, a civilian naval architecture firm, to develop construction plans that would be sent to shipyards. The program moved with extraordinary urgency. Congress authorized LST construction in 3 separate acts: February 6, 1942, May 26, 1943, and December 17, 1943. The first keel was laid at Newport News Shipbuilding on June 10, 1942. The ship was LST-386. She would be commissioned on July 28, 1943. By then, the program had exploded to multiple shipyards, simultaneously building these vessels as fast as steel could be cut and welded. LST construction was distributed to avoid bottlenecks. Newport News in Virginia built them. Norfolk Navy Yard built them. Charleston Navy Yard built them. But the most remarkable production occurred inland, at shipyards along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Evansville, Indiana, Dravo Corporation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Missouri Valley Bridge, and Iron Company, American Bridge Company. These river shipyards, hundreds of miles from the ocean, produced 2/3 of all LSTs built during the war. Ships built in Pittsburgh or Evansville would be launched into rivers, then navigate downstream to the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, and up the Atlantic coast to Norfolk or New York for final outfitting. The journey took weeks, but it worked. By spreading construction across 18 separate locations, the Navy achieved production rates that would have been impossible concentrating work at coastal yards, already building destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. The construction priority was absolute. At one yard, workers removed the already laid keel of an aircraft carrier to make room for LST construction. The landing ships were considered more critical to winning the war than another fleet carrier. Early testing required overcoming naval tradition. The Articles for the Government of the United States Navy, written in the 18th century, specified punishment for any officer who allowed his ship to founder on rocks and shoals. Deliberately driving a ship onto a beach violated every instinct of naval seamanship. At Quonset, Rhode Island, in early 1943, Niedermair attended the first full-speed beaching test. He stood next to the commanding officer of LST-1, who was understandably nervous about intentionally grounding his ship. Niedermair told him to approach the beach at full speed, 10 knots. The captain looked at the designer with something between disbelief and terror. The LST charged toward shore, bow pointed at sand, engines at full power. At 10 knots, about 11.5 miles per hour, the flat-bottomed hull drove up onto the beach. The ship's momentum carried it forward until friction and gravity brought it to a smooth stop. The bow doors opened, the ramp lowered. The ship sat upright, perfectly stable, ready to discharge cargo. When the cargo was unloaded, ballast adjustments and reverse thrust from the engines pulled the LST back off the beach without difficulty. The twin propellers and rudders, protected by the flat keel design, remained undamaged. The test proved the concept completely. These ships could be driven onto beaches repeatedly without destroying them. By late 1942, LSTs were rolling off production lines at a rate that astonished observers. Each ship required roughly 80,000 man-hours of labor to construct. The first LSTs took 8 months to build. By 1945, construction time had been cut to just 2 months from keel laying to commissioning. The production efficiency gains were remarkable, comparable to Liberty ship construction but more complex because LSTs required more intricate systems. The ballast system was the heart of the design. Massive pumps could flood or empty the tanks in less than 2 hours. Approaching a beach, the crew would begin pumping out ballast while still miles from shore. By the time the ship reached the beach, draft would be minimized, allowing the LST to drive far up onto the sand. The anchor and winch system provided additional capability. If the ship grounded on an obstacle or needed extra pulling power to retract from the beach, a stern anchor could be deployed while the ship approached shore. Once beached, the anchor winch could be used to help pull the vessel back off, supplementing engine power. The crew complement was relatively small for such a large vessel. 117 enlisted men and officers operated each LST. An additional 163 troops could be accommodated for transport. The ship carried 2 LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, the Higgins boats, in davits for ship-to-shore communication and rescue operations. Armament was defensive. 8 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 12 20mm anti-aircraft guns provided protection against air attack. The guns were positioned to cover all approaches, but LSTs were never intended as fighting ships. Their mission was to deliver cargo to hostile shores, then get off the beach as quickly as possible. The propulsion plant was diesel, 2 General Motors 12-cylinder diesel engines, each, producing 900 horsepower. The diesel engines were more fuel-efficient than steam turbines and required smaller engineering crews. Maximum speed was 11.5 knots, about 13 miles per hour. Cruising speed was typically 8 to 9 knots. The ships were slow, but speed wasn't the priority. Reliability and cargo capacity mattered more. The tank deck ventilation system was critical. When vehicles sat in the enclosed tank deck with engines running, exhaust fumes could kill the crew through carbon monoxide poisoning. Engineers at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in April 1942, constructed a full-scale mock-up of an LST tank deck. They tested ventilation systems by running tank engines inside the mock-up and measuring gas concentrations. The system they developed could evacuate harmful gases while engines ran, allowing vehicles to warm up before disembarking. Fresh air intakes on the main deck fed powerful blowers that forced clean air through the tank deck and exhausted fumes through vents. The system worked, but it was loud, and the smell of diesel exhaust became the defining sensory memory for anyone who rode in an LST. The ships entered combat in June 1943 during the Solomon Islands campaign. LSTs delivered supplies to Guadalcanal, proving the concept worked in combat conditions. The ships could navigate through coral-infested waters that would have destroyed conventional vessels, beach on coral sand, and retract without tearing their hulls apart. But the first major combat test came 1 month later, July 10, 1943, Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, 4 U.S. Army divisions, 4 British divisions, and 1 Canadian division assaulted the island in the largest amphibious operation attempted to that date. 3,200 ships and craft participated. Among them were 74 LSTs. The American landings occurred along a 40-mile shoreline in the Gulf of Gala. Licata, Gala, and Scogliti were small towns with no port facilities capable of supporting major military operations. Traditional amphibious doctrine would have required capturing a major port first, then using the port to bring in supplies. LSTs made that doctrine obsolete. The ships approached the Sicilian beaches in rough weather. The Mediterranean in July could be deceptively violent, and the crossing from North Africa encountered heavy seas that made soldiers seasick and crews miserable. LSTs, with their flat bottoms and ungainly design, rolled 40 degrees in seas that other vessels barely noticed. But when they reached the beaches at dawn on July 10th, they performed exactly as designed. Bow doors opened, ramps lowered. Sherman tanks drove directly onto Sicilian soil. Trucks followed, artillery pieces, ammunition, supplies. Everything needed to support an army appeared on beaches that had never seen heavy equipment. LST-313 was destroyed on the first day by German aerial attack. LST-312 was badly damaged, but the rest completed their missions. Tanks from LST-2 helped repulse a German counterattack on July 11th, immediately after disembarking. The official report on Operation Husky pronounced the LSTs outstanding in performance and usefulness. The ships continued operations throughout the Mediterranean campaign. At Salerno in September 1943, they landed American and British troops against determined German resistance. At Anzio in January 1944, LSTs sustained a beachhead 70 miles behind German lines, delivering supplies under constant artillery fire and air attack for months. The Anzio operation demonstrated both the capability and vulnerability of LSTs. The ships shuttled supplies from Naples to Anzio, a journey of roughly 120 miles. They would load at Naples, transit overnight, beach at Anzio under fire, unload, retract from the beach, and return to Naples. Then repeat the cycle, day after day for 4 months. German artillery targeted the beached LSTs continuously. German aircraft attacked them. The crews developed combat fatigue and shell shock from the unrelenting stress. LSTs took casualties from shell fragments and near misses, but they kept operating because the troops at Anzio would have starved without the supplies LSTs delivered. The operation vindicated Churchill's concept but also revealed the limitation. LSTs were slow. Their maximum speed of 11 knots meant they couldn't maneuver to evade attacks. They were large, their bulk made them easy targets, and they had to remain stationary on the beach while unloading, completely vulnerable to artillery fire. Yet they survived far better than predicted. Only 26 LSTs were lost to enemy action during the entire war. Of those 26, only 13 were actually sunk by enemy fire. The remaining 13 were damaged beyond repair or lost to accidents, weather, and groundings. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Given the scope of LST operations, the number of ships deployed, and the intensity of combat they experienced, the loss rate was remarkably low. By early 1944, LSTs were accumulating in Britain for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Planners calculated they needed thousands of landing craft for the assault. LSTs would provide the heavy lift capability to establish the beachhead. They would carry tanks, artillery, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and supplies directly onto French beaches. The shortage of LSTs nearly derailed Overlord. Churchill wanted to keep LSTs in the Mediterranean for the Anzio operation, but Eisenhower needed them in Britain for Normandy. The argument over LST allocation consumed weeks of planning meetings. Only by carefully scheduling LST movements, rushing ships from the Mediterranean to Britain as soon as Anzio stabilized, could enough landing ships be gathered for D-Day. June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious operation in history. 5,000 ships assembled, off the Normandy coast. Among them were hundreds of LSTs carrying the heavy equipment that would sustain the invasion. At Utah Beach, LSTs began landing at 6:30 in the morning. They ran up onto sand, dropped their ramps, and disgorged Sherman tanks that immediately engaged German defensive positions. At Omaha Beach, where resistance was fiercest, LSTs performed multiple runs throughout the day. They brought reinforcements when the initial assault stalled. They brought ammunition when supplies ran low. They evacuated wounded on return trips, transforming their tank decks into temporary hospital wards. On D-Day alone, LSTs brought 41,035 wounded soldiers back across the English Channel to hospital facilities in Britain. The ships that had landed tanks onto hostile shores returned carrying broken bodies, the human cost of the invasion. Their versatility saved thousands of lives. Over the following weeks, LSTs maintained supply lines that sustained over 1 million Allied troops in Normandy. Each day, they shuttled from British ports to French beaches, delivering the fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment that kept the armies advancing. They operated around the clock, through storms that destroyed the Mulberry Artificial Harbour, through continuing German resistance. By late August 1944, LSTs had delivered over 1 million troops, 250,000 vehicles, and 5 million tons of supplies across Normandy beaches without a single major port. Cherbourg wasn't captured until late June and wasn't functional until August. The invasion succeeded without it because LSTs made ports unnecessary, but while LSTs were proving their worth in Europe, their true significance was emerging in the Pacific. The Japanese High Command watched American amphibious operations with growing concern. Their defensive strategy for the Pacific was built around controlling key islands with major port facilities. They fortified places like Rabaul, Truk, and the major bases throughout their expanded perimeter. Traditional amphibious doctrine suggested the Americans would need to capture these ports to establish supply bases for advancing into Japanese-controlled territory. The Japanese could defend ports with overwhelming force, making each American assault a bloodbath that might exhaust American will to continue the war. But LSTs changed the equation completely. American forces began bypassing heavily fortified positions and landing on lightly defended beaches that had no infrastructure whatsoever. The strategy, called leapfrogging or island hopping, depended entirely on the capability to deliver heavy equipment directly onto unprepared beaches. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific campaign demonstrated the concept repeatedly. Operation Reckless in April 1944, the landing at Hollandia in New Guinea, bypassed Japanese garrisons at Wewak and Madang. LSTs landed an entire division on beaches 200 miles behind Japanese lines, cutting off 20,000 enemy troops who were left to starve while American forces pushed westward toward the Philippines. The Japanese couldn't respond. Their defensive positions were fixed. They'd concentrated forces at locations they assumed Americans would need to capture. When Americans simply landed elsewhere, Japanese forces couldn't redeploy quickly enough to matter. Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific campaign used the same approach, but with direct assaults on strategic islands: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each operation followed the same pattern. LSTs would approach hostile shores, beach under fire, and land Marines with tanks and artillery. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, but American material superiority, delivered directly onto beaches by LSTs, proved overwhelming. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, LSTs faced some of the most difficult beaching conditions of the war. The volcanic sand slopes were steep in places, too shallow in others. The beaches were under constant artillery fire from Japanese positions on Mount Suribachi. LSTs would nose onto black sand, lower their ramps, and send vehicles directly into combat while mortars and artillery shells exploded around them. LST-779 was hit by a Japanese mortar round that struck a gasoline-laden landing vehicle 10 feet from the ship's bow. The resulting explosion produced fragments that pierced the hull. The ship was straddled by heavy enemy fire, but completed its mission, unloading artillery and ammunition before retracting from the beach under continuing fire. At Okinawa in April 1945, LSTs put 60,000 troops ashore on the first day. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of LSTs shuttled from staging areas to the beaches, a continuous flow of men and material that built up overwhelming combat power faster than the Japanese could respond. The Japanese finally understood what LSTs meant for their defensive strategy. A captured intelligence document analyzed after the war revealed Japanese military planners had calculated that American amphibious operations would be limited by port capacity. They estimated the Americans could land 1 division at a time, maybe 2 if they accepted logistical inefficiency. Instead, Americans were landing 4, 5, 6 divisions simultaneously on beaches that had no ports at all. The cargo capacity of LSTs, 2,100 tons per ship, meant that just 50 LSTs could deliver over 100,000 tons of supplies in a few days. A conventional port might handle that tonnage, but it would take weeks to organize unloading and distribution. LSTs eliminated the bottleneck. They delivered cargo directly to the beach, where Army shore parties immediately moved it inland. No cranes, no docks, no infrastructure beyond men with trucks and determination. The simplicity was devastating to Japanese defensive planning. Japanese forces had 60% of their war casualties from starvation rather than combat. American island-hopping strategy, enabled by LSTs, cut off Japanese garrisons from supply lines. The forces bypassed couldn't be evacuated. They couldn't be reinforced. They could only sit and wait while American forces advanced past them toward Japan. By the end of the war in August 1945, American shipyards had produced 1,051 LSTs. Britain received 113 through Lend-Lease. Canada and the United Kingdom produced an additional 80 LSTs to British specifications. The total approached 1,200 LSTs built during the war. These ships participated in every major amphibious operation of the war: Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, southern France, every Pacific Island campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They transported millions of troops, delivered millions of tons of cargo, and enabled a form of warfare that had been considered impossible before 1942. The statistics tell the story clearly. On D-Day, LSTs were part of the fleet that landed 156,000 Allied troops on Normandy beaches. Within 48 hours, 130,000 GIs and 17,000 vehicles were ashore. By D+4, the force required 6,000 tons of supplies per day. By D+16, 12,000 tons per day. LSTs provided the lift capacity to meet these demands. In the Pacific, LSTs enabled operations across distances that would have been impossible, using traditional port-based logistics. Ships built in Pittsburgh navigated down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, around Florida, through the Panama Canal, and across 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean to deliver cargo to beaches in New Guinea and the Philippines and the Japanese home islands. The crews who manned these ships were mostly teenagers who had never left their hometowns before the war. They learned seamanship through trial and error, figured out cargo loading procedures through experience, and developed damage control techniques by necessity. They called their ships large, slow targets with affectionate sarcasm, understanding both the danger and the importance of their mission. The post-war assessment by naval historians concluded that LSTs were among the three most significant ship types of World War II, alongside aircraft carriers and submarines. Admiral Richmond Turner called them a marvel. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official naval historian, declared them the most useful all-around craft invented by the Navy. Their significance extended beyond immediate military applications. The roll-on roll-off ferry industry that revolutionized civilian cargo transport grew directly from LST design principles. If tanks and trucks could be driven onto a beach, the same concept could be applied to civilian commerce wherever port facilities were inadequate. The worldwide car ferry industry traces its origins to LSTs. In tactical terms, LSTs solved a problem that had frustrated military planners since ancient times: how to project power across water onto a hostile shore. Amphibious operations had always been possible, but only where defenders were weak or where geography permitted easy landings. LSTs made amphibious assault practical against determined defenders on almost any beach with a gradually sloped approach. The Japanese never developed an equivalent capability. Their amphibious doctrine relied on converted transports and relatively small landing craft. They could land troops, but they struggled to deliver heavy equipment and sustained logistics. The disparity in amphibious capability contributed significantly to Japanese defensive failures throughout the Pacific War. John Niedermair continued his distinguished career with the Bureau of Ships after the war. He was involved in preliminary design work for thousands of vessels over a 30-year career, including Essex-class aircraft carriers and revolutionary nuclear submarines. The American Society of Naval Engineers named him the father of the modern U.S. Navy. But of all the ships he designed or contributed to, the LST may have been the most consequential. The concept was simple: a ship that could carry its own stability system, approach any beach, and discharge cargo without any infrastructure. The execution required genuine engineering insight and careful attention to thousands of details. The result changed how wars were fought. Niedermair remained modest about his achievements. In his oral history recorded in 1978, he said he simply kept investigating things he didn't know until he understood them. He claimed to need only 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, which gave him more time than anyone else to work on problems. The sketch he drew in November 1941, completed in just hours, represented months of unconscious preparation. He had spent years studying how ships behaved, how stability systems worked, how cargo could be efficiently loaded and unloaded. When presented with the problem of designing a tank landing ship, his experience allowed him to see the solution quickly. But seeing the solution and implementing it are different challenges. The LST program succeeded because the Bureau of Ships moved with extraordinary urgency, because 18 shipyards committed to building these ungainly vessels, because thousands of workers cut steel and welded hulls with precision and determination, and because young crews learned to operate these ships under the most difficult conditions imaginable. LST-342 was the first LST lost in the Pacific. Operating in the Solomon Islands during the New Georgia campaign, she was torpedoed and beached on Florida Island, where her hull remains today. The wreck sits in shallow water, visible from shore, a memorial to the ship type and the men who served on them. The legacy of the LST extended into the Cold War and beyond. The Korean War demonstrated that amphibious assault remained relevant in the atomic age. The success of the Incheon landing in September 1950, where LSTs put troops and equipment ashore far behind North Korean lines, validated the concept again. Some LSTs built during World War II served into the 1990s, a testament to their robust design and continued utility. The last LST of the traditional bow door configuration was decommissioned in 2002, 57 years after the end of World War II. The ship type had evolved, with later designs incorporating improved propulsion systems and greater speed, but the basic concept remained unchanged: drive onto a beach, discharge cargo, retract, and repeat. The story of the LST demonstrates a fundamental principle about warfare. Logistics determines what is possible. Tactics and strategy matter, but they operate within constraints imposed by the ability to deliver supplies and equipment where they're needed. Before LSTs, amphibious operations were severely limited by the need to capture ports. After LSTs, beaches became as useful as ports for establishing supply lines. The Japanese High Command never fully adapted to this reality. Their defensive strategy remained focused on protecting key positions and forcing Americans to attack fortified strong points. They expected a war of attrition, where American casualties would eventually exceed American willingness to continue fighting. What they failed to anticipate was that American industrial capacity could produce landing ships faster than Japanese forces could build fortifications. By 1944, the United States was building LSTs at a rate of dozens per month. Each ship could deliver 2,100 tons of cargo directly onto hostile shores. The mathematics of American productive capacity overwhelmed Japanese defensive calculations. On March 19, 1945, while LSTs were supporting the Iwo Jima operation, John Niedermair was in Washington working on post-war naval designs. The war in Europe was nearly won. The war against Japan would require months more of bloody island fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Niedermair knew his design had contributed to that certainty. The ungainly ships, with their flat bottoms and massive bow doors, had proven more consequential than most warships that looked far more impressive. A battleship could shell an enemy position, but an LST could deliver the army that would capture that position and hold it. When the war ended in August 1945, LST production stopped immediately. Hundreds of LSTs were scrapped or sunk. Some were sold to civilian operators for conversion to cargo vessels. Most were placed in reserve fleets, mothballed against future need. The massive industrial mobilization that had produced them was no longer necessary. The cost of an LST was approximately $1.5 million in 1945 currency, roughly equivalent to $25 million in today's purchasing power. For that cost, the Navy received a vessel that could cross oceans, survive combat damage, and deliver critical cargo directly to hostile shores repeatedly. The return on investment was extraordinary. The men who served on LSTs never received the same recognition as carrier aviators or submarine crews. LSTs didn't sink enemy warships or shoot down enemy aircraft. They simply delivered cargo to beaches, mission after mission, under fire, in all weather, until the war was won. But that mission was essential. Without LSTs, the invasion of Sicily would have required capturing a major port first. The Normandy invasion would have been impossible on the scale actually achieved. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific would have bogged down at each fortified position. The entire Allied strategy in both theatres depended on the ability to land heavy equipment on beaches without ports. John Niedermair died in 1982 at age 91. By then, the LSTs he designed had been largely superseded by more modern amphibious ships, but the principle remained. Naval architects still design vessels capable of shore-to-shore delivery of heavy cargo because the concept Niedermair refined in November 1941 proved fundamentally sound. The Japanese never expected LSTs to carry 2,100 tons and beach without docks because their defensive calculations assumed port-based logistics. That assumption, reasonable by pre-war standards, became obsolete the moment the first LST drove its bow onto a hostile beach and began discharging tanks. The innovation wasn't dramatic. No new technology was required. Diesel engines, ballast pumps, welded steel hulls, all existed before LSTs. Niedermair's contribution was recognizing how existing technologies could be combined to solve a problem others had declared unsolvable. That recognition changed the course of the war. It enabled operations that Japanese planners had calculated were impossible. It rendered obsolete defensive strategies based on protecting ports. It proved that industrial capacity and engineering creativity could overcome tactical disadvantages. In the end, the ungainly ship with the flat bottom and the massive bow doors, the vessel sailors mockingly called large, slow target, became one of the most important warships ever built, not because it was fast or heavily armed or technologically sophisticated, but because it solved a problem that needed solving and did so with remarkable efficiency and reliability. The LST proved that sometimes the most consequential innovations are not the most glamorous ones. Sometimes victory comes not from dramatic breakthroughs but from careful engineering that makes the difficult merely routine. 2,100 tons of cargo delivered directly onto a hostile beach. No docks, no cranes, no infrastructure. Just a well-designed ship, a determined crew, and the recognition that what others considered impossible was actually just very difficult. And in warfare, making the difficult routine is often more valuable than making the impossible possible, because wars are won through sustained operations, not single brilliant strokes. The LST enabled sustained operations on a scale that exhausted enemy resistance. That was Niedermair's contribution, and it changed history. The morning of July 10, 1943, off the coast of Sicily, a young ensign named Frederick Clerk stood on the bridge of LST 358, watching the shoreline approach through binoculars. His ship carried 18 Sherman tanks in the tank deck and 6 trucks on the main deck. In a few minutes, those tanks would drive onto Italian soil and begin the liberation of Europe. Clerk had been trained as a naval officer, taught to navigate by stars, to maintain proper formation in convoy, to read weather patterns and anticipate storms. But nothing in his training had prepared him for deliberately driving a 328-foot ship directly onto a beach at full speed. The concept violated every instinct about how to operate a vessel safely, yet that was exactly what he was about to do. The beach at Gela was 2 miles ahead. German and Italian forces held defensive positions inland. The pre-invasion bombardment had been firing for an hour, battleships and cruisers hurling shells at suspected enemy locations. Smoke drifted across the water from explosions on shore. LST 358 was part of a wave of landing ships approaching the beach in line abreast. To Clerk's left, LST 357. To his right, LST 359. Behind them, more LSTs, and behind those, landing craft infantry carrying troops, and behind those, transports waiting offshore with follow-on forces. The plan called for LSTs to beach simultaneously across a several-mile front, discharge their tanks, and retract from the beach as quickly as possible to make room for the next wave. Timing was critical. If ships took too long to unload, they would create congestion on the beach that could paralyze the entire operation. Clerk ordered his crew to begin pumping out ballast tanks. The ship rose perceptibly in the water as thousands of gallons of seawater were expelled. Forward draft decreased from 8 feet to less than 4 feet. The LST was now in landing configuration, riding high and light, ready to drive far up onto the sand, 1 mile from shore. Enemy artillery began firing. Splashes appeared in the water as shells fell short. The LSTs maintained course and speed. The flat-bottomed hulls made them difficult to maneuver, but they were committed now. Turning away would disrupt the entire landing sequence. 1/2 mile from shore, Clerk could see the beach clearly now. Dark sand, no obstacles visible. The beach gradient looked adequate. His intelligence briefing had indicated this stretch of coast would be suitable for LST operations, but intelligence had been wrong before. Clerk gripped the bridge railing and watched the distance close. His engine room reported ready for beaching. His tank deck crew reported vehicles were secured and ready for discharge. His bow crew stood by to open the massive clamshell doors and lower the ramp. 300 yards, 200, 100. The LST's bow touched bottom, but momentum carried the ship forward, the flat keel sliding up onto the sand. Clerk felt the deceleration through his feet, a gradual slowing as friction increased. The ship drove further onto the beach, further, until finally the momentum was spent and LST 358 came to rest. The bow was on dry sand. The stern floated in about 6 feet of water. The ship sat level, perfectly stable. Clerk had just accomplished something that would have ended his career before the war. He had deliberately grounded his ship on a hostile beach under enemy fire. But the mission was just beginning. The bow doors swung, open with a hydraulic hiss. The ramp lowered, its end touching Sicilian sand. Clark passed the word to the tank deck, "Vehicles away." The first Sherman tank, a 30-ton mass of armor and firepower, rolled down the ramp and onto Italian soil. Its tracks bit into sand, then found purchase. The tank moved inland, heading for its assigned sector. The second tank followed, then the third. German artillery was bracketing the beach now. Shells exploded in the water between LSTs. One shell hit close enough to send spray across LST 358's deck. Clark ignored it. 18 tanks. That was his cargo. 18 tanks had to get off this ship before he could retract. The tank discharge took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of standing on a hostile beach while artillery fire walked across the landing zone. 12 minutes during which a single direct hit could have ignited the fuel and ammunition in those tanks and turned LST 358 into a floating funeral pyre. But the hit didn't come. The last tank rolled off the ramp. Clark ordered the ramp raised, the bow doors closed. Then he ordered the engine room to give him full power in reverse. The propellers bit into the water. The LST vibrated as the engines strained. For a moment, nothing happened. The ship remained firmly grounded. Clark had the stern anchor deployed before beaching, a precaution Niedermair's design incorporated specifically for this situation. He ordered the anchor winch engaged. The mechanical winch pulled on the anchor cable, adding its force to the engine's thrust. The LST began to move, sliding backward off the sand. Within 3 minutes, LST 358 was floating free. Clark ordered course set for the transport area offshore. His ship would load more cargo from larger vessels, then make another run to the beach. The cycle would repeat until Sicily was secured or until his ship was destroyed. Those were the only 2 ways this operation would end. LST 358 made 4 more beach runs that day. Each time, Clark drove the bow onto sand, discharged cargo under fire, and retracted successfully. On the second run, he carried trucks loaded with ammunition. On the third run, artillery pieces and their crews. On the fourth run, fuel in drums. On the fifth run, medical supplies and additional troops. By nightfall, LST 358 had delivered over 1,000 tons of cargo directly onto a beach that had no port, no cranes, no infrastructure of any kind, and Clark's ship was just one of 74 LSTs operating that day off Sicily. Collectively, they delivered more cargo in 12 hours than a major port could have handled in a week, and they did it while under fire. 2 LSTs were lost that first day. LST 313 was hit by a German bomber and sank. LST 312 was badly damaged and had to be towed away. But 72 LSTs survived and continued operations. The ratio of ships lost to missions completed validated Niedermair's design philosophy completely. Clark would go on to command LST 358 through the Salerno landings in September 1943. His ship earned 4 battle stars. After Salerno, Clark was transferred to Norfolk to teach other LST commanders the techniques he had developed through hard experience. What he taught them was this: LSTs survived through aggressive action, not caution. You drove onto the beach fast, unloaded fast, retracted fast. The longer you remained grounded, the more vulnerable you became. Speed of execution was the only defense against artillery and air attack. He also taught them that LST operations required absolute trust in the engineering design. You had to believe the flat keel would protect your propellers when you grounded. You had to trust the ballast system would work when you needed to reduce draft. You had to have faith that the bow doors would open under stress and the ramp would lower even when the ship was vibrating from nearby explosions. That trust was justified. LSTs proved remarkably robust. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed conventional ships. The brilliant structural arrangement that Niedermair's team developed provided unusual strength and buoyancy. HMS LST 3002 was struck and holed in a post-war collision with a Victory ship and survived. In the Pacific, LST operations faced different challenges. Coral reefs and volcanic sand beaches tested the ship's capabilities in ways European operations had not. At Tarawa in November 1943, LSTs discovered that coral could tear hulls if approach angles were wrong. Crews learned to read the water, watching for color changes that indicated coral heads. At Iwo Jima, in February 1945, the volcanic sand beaches had unpredictable gradients. Some areas were too steep, others too shallow. LSTs would beach and find their ramps couldn't reach solid ground, forcing them to retract and try another location. The flexibility to relocate quickly proved essential. LST 779, mentioned earlier, participated in the Iwo Jima landing as part of the initial assault wave. The ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph Hopkins, brought his vessel onto Beach Red 1 at 0650 on February 19, 1945. The beach was under heavy fire from Japanese positions on Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominated the southern end of the island. Hopkins could see Marines struggling through the volcanic sand, which was so fine that vehicles bogged down and men sank to their ankles with each step. His cargo was artillery, massive guns that would provide fire support for the Marine advance. The guns were lashed to trucks on his tank deck. The trucks would drive off the LST, position the guns, and begin firing within minutes of landing. But first, Hopkins had to get his ship onto the beach. He aimed for a section of shoreline that looked promising and drove LST 779 straight in at 9 knots. The bow hit volcanic sand and the ship rode up onto the beach, its flat keel distributing weight across a broad area. The bow doors opened, the ramp lowered. Hopkins could see Marines taking cover behind whatever obstacles they could find, pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire from caves and bunkers inland. The artillery he was about to unload would help suppress those positions. The first truck rolled off the ramp, its gun bouncing on the suspension as the vehicle hit the sand. The truck's wheels immediately sank 6 inches into the volcanic material. The driver gunned the engine and the truck lurched forward, making slow progress toward the assembly area where the gun would be set up. At 0425, a Japanese mortar round hit a gasoline-laden tracked landing vehicle that was positioned 10 feet from LST 779's bow. The explosion was catastrophic. Burning gasoline sprayed across the beach and onto the ship's bow. Fragments from the destroyed vehicle tore through the LST's hull plating, creating holes that immediately began taking on water. Hopkins ordered fire crews to combat the flames while continuing to unload cargo. His mission was to deliver those artillery pieces. Fire on the bow did not change that mission. His crew fought the flames while trucks continued rolling off the ramp. The artillery was completely unloaded by 0443. Hopkins ordered retraction from the beach. The holes in his hull were a problem, but not an immediate crisis. The LST's compartmentalized design meant damage to the bow didn't threaten the entire ship. Watertight doors were closed, isolating the damaged sections. LST 779 retracted successfully and reported to the amphibious command ship Auburn for debriefing. Rear Admiral Harry Hill, commanding Task Force 53, questioned Hopkins personally about beaching conditions, traction for vehicles on the volcanic sand, and cargo unloaded. Hopkins reported that the beach was suitable for LST operations, but that vehicles would need help getting off the beach due to the fine volcanic sand. He recommended that follow-on LSTs bring timbers or metal matting to create temporary roadways from the waterline inland. His recommendations were implemented immediately, improving conditions for subsequent landings. LST 779 made temporary repairs to her hull, using mattresses plugged into the holes to reduce water infiltration. She remained in the Iwo Jima operating area for 6 more days, making additional runs to the beach with supplies and equipment. On February 28, she departed for Saipan, where permanent repairs could be made. The ship's experience was typical of LST operations throughout the Pacific. Challenging conditions, enemy fire, damage, repairs, return to operations. The crews developed a gallows humor about their ship's vulnerability, hence the nicknames Large Slow Target and Large Stationary Target. But beneath the humor was pride in accomplishing missions under circumstances that would have paralyzed operations using conventional vessels. By spring 1945, American forces were approaching the Japanese home islands. Okinawa, the final stepping stone before an invasion of Japan proper, was assaulted on April 1, 1945. The operation involved 1,400 ships, including hundreds of LSTs. The scale of LST operations at Okinawa exceeded everything that had come before. On the first day, 60,000 troops came ashore. Over the following weeks, LSTs delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies to support the largest land campaign of the Pacific War. Japanese kamikaze attacks targeted the invasion fleet relentlessly. LSTs were priority targets. Several were hit, some were sunk, but the majority survived and continued operations. The damage control procedures crews had developed through years of experience saved ships that should have been lost. One LST, hit by a kamikaze aircraft that crashed through the main deck and exploded in the tank deck, fought fires for 6 hours before finally getting them under control. The ship's bow was a twisted wreck. Her tank deck was destroyed, but her engine room and after sections remained functional. The crew kept the engines running, and the ship eventually made port under her own power. That resilience, repeated across hundreds of LSTs in dozens of operations, demonstrated the fundamental soundness of Niedermair's design. The ships could absorb tremendous damage and remain functional because every system had redundancy and every compartment was isolated from every other compartment. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing American amphibious capabilities after multiple defeats, finally understood what they were facing. Captured documents from mid-1945 show Japanese planners had calculated American logistics based on pre-war assumptions about port capacity. They estimated Americans could land 1 or 2 divisions at a time and would need to capture a port to sustain those forces. Japanese defensive strategy was built around holding key ports and forcing Americans to attack fortified positions at enormous cost. But by 1945, Japanese planners realized Americans were landing 4 to 6 divisions simultaneously on beaches that had no ports whatsoever. The intelligence analysis expressed shock at the tonnage figures. American LSTs were delivering cargo at rates that seemed impossible. One Japanese naval officer, writing in his diary after witnessing American operations at Okinawa, noted that each American landing ship appeared to carry more cargo than an entire Japanese supply convoy. He calculated that 50 American LSTs could deliver more supplies in a single day than the Japanese Navy could transport to an island base in a month. The arithmetic of American productive capacity had overwhelmed Japanese defensive planning. By 1945, the United States was building LSTs faster than Japan could build fortifications to defend against them. Each LST represented one more ship capable of landing 2,100 tons of cargo directly onto a hostile shore. Japanese forces couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. American LSTs meant Americans didn't need to attack where Japanese forces were concentrated. They could land wherever defenses were weakest, and LSTs would provide the logistics to sustain operations regardless of port availability. The strategic implications were devastating for Japan. Every island in the Pacific was now vulnerable. Every beach was a potential landing site. Japanese forces couldn't predict where Americans would strike next because Americans didn't need to capture specific objectives. They could leapfrog from island to island, establishing air bases and supply depots on beaches that had been considered unsuitable for major operations. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japanese military leaders finally recommended surrender. But even without the atomic bombs, the strategic situation was hopeless. American LSTs and the amphibious capability they provided meant Japan could no longer defend its home islands effectively. An invasion of Japan, if it had become necessary, would have used thousands of LSTs to land dozens of divisions on beaches around Tokyo Bay and the southern home islands. Japanese planners knew they couldn't stop such an invasion. They might kill hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, but they couldn't prevent Americans from landing, establishing beachheads, and building up overwhelming force. The LST, that ungainly vessel designed by John Niedermair in a few hours in November 1941, had become the instrument that made American victory inevitable, not through dramatic combat actions, but through relentless, sustained logistics that defeated Japanese defensive strategy. When the war ended, LST production stopped immediately. The enormous industrial mobilization was no longer needed, but the ships themselves continued to serve. Some were sold to allies, some were converted for civilian use, Many were placed in reserve fleets, mothballed against future conflict. The Korean War proved LSTs remained relevant. At Incheon in September 1950, American and South Korean forces conducted an amphibious assault deep behind North Korean lines. LSTs landed the 1st Marine Division and supporting units in one of the most successful amphibious operations in military history. The Incheon landing cut North Korean supply lines and contributed directly to the collapse of the North Korean invasion of South Korea. Some World War II-era LSTs served into the 1990s. The ships built in 1943 and 1944 were still operating 50 years later, testament to their robust construction and continued utility. Newer designs incorporated improvements in propulsion and habitability, but the basic concept remained unchanged. The last traditional bow door LST was decommissioned in 2002. By then, the Navy had shifted to more sophisticated amphibious assault ships, but the principle Niedermair established endured. Shore-to-shore delivery of heavy cargo remained a fundamental naval capability, and every modern amphibious ship traces its lineage to the LST. John Niedermair never sought recognition for his work. He remained with the Bureau of Ships throughout his career, contributing to countless designs, solving innumerable problems. The LST was one achievement among many for him, though it was perhaps the most consequential. When interviewed in his later years, Niedermair spoke about the LST with characteristic modesty. He described the design challenge and the solution in technical terms, emphasizing that the concept wasn't particularly complex. A ballast system to reconcile deep-draft ocean transit with shallow-draft beach operations, bow doors and a ramp to facilitate vehicle discharge, a flat keel to protect propellers and rudders during beaching. What he didn't emphasize, perhaps didn't fully appreciate, was how his solution had changed warfare. Before LSTs, amphibious operations were limited, dangerous, and dependent on capturing ports. After LSTs, beaches became highways for invasion forces. The Japanese High Command never expected Allied forces to deliver 2,100 tons of cargo directly onto beaches without any dock infrastructure. That expectation, reasonable before November 1941, became obsolete the moment Niedermair completed his sketch. And that obsolescence cascaded through Japanese defensive planning, rendering ineffective the fortifications they had spent years constructing, the strategies they had carefully developed, the calculations they had meticulously verified, all made irrelevant by an American naval architect who spent a few hours with a pencil and paper solving a problem others had declared unsolvable. The story of the LST is ultimately about how warfare evolves not through dramatic technological breakthroughs, but through practical engineering that makes the difficult routine. John Niedermair didn't invent new technology. He combined existing technologies in a novel way to solve a specific problem. That solution, refined and produced at scale by American industry, became one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. And somewhere in the Pacific, on beaches that once witnessed the fury of combat, rust-stained pieces of LST hulls still sit half-buried in sand, monuments to the ungainly ships that carried victory across hostile shores. Reminders that the most consequential innovations are not always the most glamorous ones. Sometimes, changing history requires nothing more than a well-designed ship, a determined crew, and the recognition that 2,100 tons delivered directly onto a beach can be more powerful than the mightiest fortress. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.